My name is April Hynes. I'm from Philadelphia, outside of Philadelphia. My family and I live in Washington Crossing, PA. We've lived there for the last 14 years. We have three beautiful children, Peyton, Isabella, and Ava, and have been in the area most of all of our lives. It's hard to explain what I do. It's something you can't capture in one sentence. Often I say, well, I'm telling a story about the last slave ship to come to Georgia and how a face jug brought the story along a journey, took me on a journey to discover these last imported Africans. It's always fun to share with people because, the project has brought so many wonderful opportunities that I never would have had before, of traveling to places that I've never traveled before, getting to lecture at the Smithsonian Institute and Boston University, getting to meet with such amazing scholars that have so much information, and I've learned like an entire PhD from all these people on this subject, and it's been fun to share with people when they ask. They had left Scotland because there was a terrible conditions in the coal mines, which had killed many of my ancestors in a very well-known explosion in Blantyre, Scotland. And my grandmother, being a pioneer, left her family, her husband, and her three children behind to sail to America to begin a new life here as Americans. And she left on her own with her bag and sailed to Philadelphia and began to work as a nurse and an aide to some of the wealthy Philadelphians, and earned enough money to send for passage for her family to join her here, which they did around 1923. And they lived in the Germantown section of Philadelphia from that time on. My mother grew up in the same house and lived there for quite some time until they moved to Montgomery County. That was difficult, but in many ways it prepared me for the spirit that I have. And he passed away suddenly from a heart attack when I was about 10 years old. But in a way, it was a gift because what that did was transport our family from our home that we had there in King of Prussia, and it brought us to my grandfather's home, and his nurturing, his deep faith, his influence greatly affected me. Seeing him every day, in his recliner with a Bible on his lap and spending every moment caring about other people, praying for other people, how he reacted and was kind and gracious. His great faith absolutely was a gift that he passed on to me that wouldn't have been given if the circumstances that I was in were not present. So that's something I think even from very early age, I understood that, and I thought it was, I've always seen how you you don't look at the end or the beginning, you just go through the journey and everything works together for your good. So living with him was definitely a blessing. My grandfather, Scotty, Robert Strang, was born in Scotland, and he came over to the United States with his mother and his family around 1923. And after my father passed away, my mother, my brother, and I moved in with Scotty and my grandmother, who was passing away from Huntington's disease. And we had moved in, and Scotty graciously took us all in, and we lived with him, which was probably the most instrumental thing in my life. My grandfather and I had such a deep bond and such a wonderful friendship and relationship, and I really grew into the woman I am because I grew up on his knee and, listening to his stories. And he was a great storyteller, and he loved for people to listen to him. And I certainly loved people's stories, especially his stories. And so that's actually how I first learned about the face jug that was in our family. I was homesick from high school, I believe, and I was laying on the couch, not feeling well, and my grandfather in his recliner across from me. We were sharing conversations, and honestly, I was just listening to his stories. And one by one, many of them that I've heard millions of times, a new one sprung up, and it certainly perked my interest because he told me about one day on a job, which often I heard very much about, and how all the curious objects that he would unearth in the ground. But this one was very special because when he was digging for what I believe was probably a trench for piping in Philadelphia, probably around 1950, 1952, his shovel curiously clanked against something, and he reached down and pulled it up out of the ground, turned it around, and here was this face glaring back at him. And not having any idea what on earth it was, he showed it to his foreman and a couple of his guys, and they said, "Oh, maybe it's a piece of Indian pottery. It might be worth something. Just take it home, Scotty." So he did. And so he brought it back to their house in Germantown, Philadelphia, which was only a few blocks, if not a block away, from where he was working that day, and carried it in when he dropped his keys and placed it on the dining room table, and shocked everyone in the family, who all seemed to have that interest the minute you see this face, and asked what it was. And he just said, "Well, it's a piece of Indian pottery. Maybe it's worth something." And it landed on the rusting radiator next to the fireplace and remained there for many, many years. There's even a picture of my aunt on my mom's wedding day posing by the fireplace, and in that background you can see that face jug there. No one knew what it was, and it somehow, amazingly, was not thrown out. My family being deeply religious, and it looking kind of strange or scary affected my grandmom, where she actually turned it around because she didn't like it looking at her, and didn't want to scare away her church friends who were over for a Bible study. But it, thankfully, my grandfather felt it was important, and he had the insight to keep it and to preserve it. The face jug remained in our family for quite some time after the Germantown house our family owned. It was moved to Orland, Pennsylvania, and remained there throughout my childhood, but I had never seen the face jug because at this point my mother had relinquished it to a shoebox in the attic since it was so ugly. And there it remained. And when I was on the couch talking to my grandfather and he was explaining this remarkable story of this discovery, I asked to see it, and he said, "Well, it's in the attic. Next time you go up, you should take a look at it." And I just quickly forgot about it, and it didn't come to my mind until years later. I think the biggest impact my grandfather made on me was just his simplicity and his goodness. And one thing, a man of habit he would shuffle in early in the morning, and he would have his sugar already in his mug expecting his coffee, and he would pour himself a cup of coffee and went to his little recliner, reclined, put a blanket on his lap, and began to open the Bible and read scripture, and pray for people. And it was very nurturing because I would hear my own name being called out and prayed for. So you just always knew that you had this source of protection around you, that, he was warding off things that may happen, and just being a wonderful man of faith. And so as I grew up and, became a mother myself, my faith was growing, and I adopted those same practices of waking up very early in the morning and pouring my coffee and having my scripture on my lap. And that's something that was very important to me. I think I can relate on a human level to feeling what we all feel, whether we're African American or Caucasian, whether we're male or female. We all share the human spirit. We all share the basic of emotions, happiness, sadness. I think I can always have a feeling of relating to a sense of oppression, and in a way, bondage. My ancestors have been in bondage to a genetic disease called Huntington's that has affected, as far as we can go back to the 1800s, every single generation of my family. Sadly, it took the life of my grandmother, and it's a terrible disease. It takes away everything that you are. It is a neurodegenerative brain disease, so it affects your mind, it affects your ability to walk and talk, eventually leading to an early demise. So it was very difficult growing up to watch my grandmother deteriorate. And it looms over you because the next generation may inherit it, which is a 50-50 chance for every child that has a parent with Huntington's. So worrying about my mother, and my aunt, who I was very close with, was something that is always in the back of your mind. And feeling that bondage, that you can't break from that. There's no cure, there's no treatment. And how it's just taken so many lives in our family. So it was very devastating to find out that my mother inherited the gene, and then shortly, a few months later, we realized my aunt had inherited the gene. So that was a difficult thing to go through, and it's oppressive because you try, to get through the next generation. And I worry about my children, so I can relate. One particular day, I had the difficult task of moving my mother and my aunt into a nursing home after they were severely injured in a car accident, and it was causing more deterioration towards their disease. And it was a difficult day. I started it off with my coffee and my Bible on my lap, and seeking some encouragement, some inspiration for what I knew was going to be a difficult day. And I had pulled out this brochure that I had gotten from In Touch magazine, and it was a story about a group of Africans that were overcoming insurmountable hardships during what was a very brutal and violent civil war. And the people of this particular village were being bombed, and their children were being killed, but yet they could come out the next day and get up and rejoice. And they were talking about singing these songs of praise, even through what seemed like, the worst of storms. And I so related to it that I marked it up and kept it in my Bible. And he had mentioned a Bible verse in this story, and it was 2 Corinthians, and it talked about how the human spirit, as human beings, we are so fragile. We're like jars of clay. We're hard-pressed on every side, but not crushed. We're persecuted, but not abandoned. And I clung to that verse and prayed and left for my mother's house that day. More miraculously was my brother was supposed to go that day, and he had been called into work and couldn't make it. So I was asked to go over, and I sat outside, went inside, and began to go through all of our family heirlooms and hearing the stories of my ancestors, pieces of their pottery and how they received them and the stories behind them. And, I was listening very carefully since I was being given these items. And my aunt came out and she said, "Oh, there's just one more jug, the one that Scotty found." I was too busy wrapping things with bubble wrap, and off she went, and she came back, and from around the corner of the kitchen, she came out with a face jug. And I looked up and I said, "Oh my gosh, what is that thing? That's what Scotty found?" And she said, "Yes, we don't know what it is." And I said, "Oh my gosh, this is something amazing." I think I was so instantly attracted to it, moved by it, curious. And I had wrapped it up in a beach towel and drove it home. And just like my grandfather had done 60 years earlier, I threw my keys down, threw it on the dining room table, and everyone in my family asked me, "What the heck is that thing?" Not knowing what it was, I went on the clues that my grandfather had, that maybe it was a piece of Indian pottery. I didn't have any background in pottery and aesthetics, so I went down to my computer and began to Google things, Indian pottery, jug, face, nothing came up. And so a few taps on the keyboard, and up came, I must have put in face jug, and up came the collection and a photograph at the Smithsonian Institute of their 3 face jugs. And instantly I said, "Oh my God, this is something really important." And I called my mom on the phone and I said, "Mom, these are in the Smithsonian Institute. This is crazy." And I began to instantly, sending emails to people with, headers like, "What the heck is this thing?" And, typing in face jug, and got connected with Gary Dexter and him sharing with me their value, their connection to African American slaves in the South, all of this knowledge, the Wanderer slave ship, all these things all flying out at me at the same time, and was so exciting to discover what we had. And I had run up the stairs and quickly put it in the china closet to keep it safe. When I Googled face jugs and the Smithsonian picture came up and it titled them Edgefield face vessels, I instantly started to Google them and saw a website from a potter named Gary Dexter. And so I quickly sent a picture of my jug over to Gary and was hoping he'd answer me quickly, which he did. And he was really the first person to give me all of the history of Edgefield potteries, of face jugs, their connection to enslaved craftsmen in the South, and the slave ship, the Wanderer. And as I began to learn more about it, learn more about the people behind it, that enslaved people in the potteries of Edgefield County had influenced it, I just was so moved by it. I was so completely curious of how my jug traveled 700 miles north from Edgefield to Germantown, Philadelphia, where my grandfather found it. And I just happened to see a commercial for history detectives on PBS that if you have a curious object that relates to history, call in. So I ended up sending an email to one of the producers, not thinking that I'd get a reply. And within an hour, got a call from the producers who thought they were absolutely fascinating objects. They've never heard of a face jug. And, we put together a plan to have a show in the future. So they came out in April and began to film with us. I had my face jug placed in my china closet, which was the front room of our house. So every time I came in the house, the first thing I saw was this smiling Chestershire smile face that was glaring at me. And so it was the first thing I would see every time I came in. So one day I went over to the jug and I'm looking at it, I'm staring at it, and I'm looking and I'm thinking about enslaved craftsmen. I'm thinking about who were they? Who made this jug? And I felt this deep connection with the people that made it, the hands that turned it. So much so, I said, I got to name this jug. And I said, well, maybe I'll name it Dave, once I learned about Dave, the famous enslaved potter. And I said, oh boy, those are two shoes to fill that are too big to fill. And then I said, well, maybe I'll name it B.F. Landrum, and that was too long. So I said, Miles Lewis, how about we name it Lewis? And so it had a name, and again, every time I would go by it, I would have to come to it, and I'd have to listen to it. And I would almost hear, find us, tell our stories, find us, tell our stories. And it was so powerful that I actually made a promise to the jug. It was so powerful, this force, this calling, that I started to question my own sanity. Am I going crazy? What is this jug? I'm reading way too into it. Certainly, with being raised in a Christian family, you don't look at things that might represent something evil or mess around with spirits. So that initially was a troubled thought, but I ended up wanting to know about it and felt a personal connection that I had been asked to do this. So that was really a driving force and an energy behind it. So what I began to do is look for how it was brought 700 miles north, and PBS couldn't tell me that. They could tell me that there was an identical jug to it at the Metropolitan, which was the big reveal, and certainly very exciting, but it left me with that loss of not telling the personal story. So I had gone down to the Philadelphia archives with a friend and began to peel through every piece of information that I had on the property location, which I was able to actually identify because my mother and my aunt lived a few blocks from where my grandfather had found it, and it's now called Leeds Middle School, which is still there. So that being known, and my aunt and my mother were still alive, I was able to take those clues and actually narrow it down to where it was found. And so I began to peel through every single piece of person that was involved in that property at the time, and was looking for some connection to Edgefield, whether it was someone who came from South Carolina, whether it was an African American that came from South Carolina. And it wasn't until I came across one of the censuses that listed 2 African Americans that lived at the house. And one was the chauffeur and one was the private cook. And they were listed on the census of being born in South Carolina. So here, having 2 African Americans from South Carolina was a huge hit. And I quickly typed on Ancestry.com, looking for this man's draft card to figure out where he was born in Edgefield, South Carolina. And here he was born in Edgefield, South Carolina. Instantly, I knew this was the connection. And when I scrolled up the document to look at his name, he was a garden hire, and then his first name was Lewis.